On October 1st to 3rd, 60 experts in the field of climate policy and climate science gathered at the Center for International Governance Innovation to discuss some of the key issues and challenges surrounding the threat of climate change and the need for an ambitious global response.
The conference proceeded with a series of roundtable discussions, keynote addresses, and expert panels aimed at stimulating a lively discussion with regards to strategies and priorities for both short-term and long-term responses to global governance of climate change. And throughout the conference, we had the opportunity to sit down with some of the conference participants and get their insights and opinions on the key topics that were raised during the discussions.
The following is the main discussion that we had with our roundtable moderators, and we will also be releasing individual interviews with conference participants in the days to come.
I think one of the interesting things that came out of this discussion is that that climate change and energy is a kind of cross-cutting issue. It's a kind of issue that it can't best be left to environment ministers, which it has been up until now. And we've had a lively discussion about this question of how do you bring this onto the agenda of leaders with sufficient warning and attention that they actually understand the issue, unlike Copenhagen, where plane loads of people appeared at the last minute, were given things by their negotiators and their delegates to sign, and clearly felt uncomfortable with it. So maybe we could chat a little bit about that. Bruce, you talked about this because you actually had an example of a sort of human example of being stuck in this situation.
Well, I think the high stakes poker of bringing leaders to bear on the subject matter at the end of a conference didn't work in Copenhagen, and I really don't think would work. I think we all know how as we move forward in meetings like Copenhagen, usually there's a communique or an agreement that's drafted well before the meeting. And what we don't need again is leaders getting off, as happened to me, leaders getting off the plane wondering where their text is and being able to tell them there is no text. So which is not a pleasant time for either the leader, or certainly wasn't for me either. So I think backing up and trying to look at various ways of doing this in either a bottom-up, top-down method, I think would probably work better than leaving it to the high-stakes game at the very end of bringing leaders in. We talked about having a safe place for leaders and for ministers to dialogue with each other, and I think that was one of the more poignant parts, I think, of the last panel we had.
Yeah, it's interesting because the point I was making was that they negotiated almost non-stop last year, literally almost non-stop, but never had a conversation that wasn't part of an official conversation as a negotiator. And Nick, you had some ideas as to how one might sort of cut through that and actually find a way to create conversations that weren't negotiations so that they could try out ideas on each other?
Yes, because I think the one thing that came very strongly was everybody realised that in the end there are so many different pieces of policy that have to be compared and brought together. Those final big decisions do have to be on a leader's level, but you have to prepare for that. You have to prepare for that in terms of briefing their advisors and making sure their advisors understand each other, and building trust and understanding between leaders and of each other's countries. There was a talk about preparing kind of an atmosphere of intimacy and finding spaces where people can look into each other's eyes and really gauge the intent of the other. And what we saw in Copenhagen was actually a lot of conversations between leaders on the phone that actually built mistrust and misexpectations, and that was one of the things that caused such a lot of bad feeling, particularly between Europe and China after the event. So as we prepare towards another place where we would have to bring leaders together, setting up a process where we take their advisors and make them work together for 2 to 3 years, going through the issues, building their confidence and understanding of each other's positions and personal relationships. And you can never underestimate the importance of personal relationships and this level of politics. Is sort of a practical way forward. And I think the main thing is we're going to use leaders again. Let's invest in getting it right this time, and realise that's going to take a bit of patience about how long that will take as well.
Kathy, one of the things that comes up obviously is how do you make this issue relevant to developing countries, and particularly what sort of financial arrangements are needed to not just bring developing countries on board, but to help them pay at least for the cost of adapting to the climate change that's already occurred. And you had years of experience at the bank doing it. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, I think this is all really about building trust as well, because you have different constituencies within the developing country world. You've got the poorest countries, the least developing countries, the small island states who are incredibly vulnerable, and their people are the ones that are going to be impacted the most. And what they're worried about is that development finance is going to be taken away and it's going to be pushed into mitigation. They need to see flows of funds coming to help them adapt, as well as helping to move to a green economy. So a lot of the conversation in Copenhagen, I think it'll happen in Cancun, it's going to happen in the future, is going to be how do you build a financing structure that will help these countries really adapt to the future. The middle income countries are looking for how do we actually accelerate the introduction of cleaner technologies, and can we see incentives that will help make that happen? And what we're seeing, and then to go back a little bit to what we saw in Copenhagen, what I think is not going to be, going to be difficulties in Cancun, is the money actually there? And for the sums of money that we're talking about, 30 billion fast start, 100 billion per year for a future regime, those that are providing the money are going to be looking for some targets being set, not just by the developed and developing countries. That is part of the puzzle.
What's your guess as to how much money is actually on the table at this stage for Cancun?
Well, I think we can see that we have some constellation of the 30 billion that was put forward for Fast Start. A lot of that's rebranding of past finance, but what's happening is that's being accelerated to actually get it spent. So that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. My sense is that there will be some proposals coming out of this fairly high-level task force looking at financial flows, but unlikely that they're going to get traction in today's financial environment, because they're talking about really some fairly major sums of money. So that's one problem. The second, it's not clear to me that some of the large countries that would have to provide this are going to be ready to move until they see progress in some of the other issues.
Bruce, you serve as an advisor to the Canadian government, and the minister, Jim Prentice, started off the meeting by reminding everybody that Canada, I guess, was one of the first donors to this Quick Start Fund, this sort of $400 million. How difficult is that?
Well, it's fortunate for the Canadian government because we're in a better economic position than most governments. But I think going forward, we're going to have to take a look at what other governments put forward, because there's an awful lot of governments that made the commitment in Copenhagen that don't have a lot of money to put on the table, and it's going to be very, very important that for the trust, and the trust was a big issue that was raised in the last day and a half. The trust of the people around the table with each other. So if the money is not forthcoming, then I think we'll lose a lot of trust. The other issue, as Kathy mentioned, is the issue of accountability, and we've got to work on a scheme or a process of accountability that so that the countries that are putting up the money feel that the money is being spent on projects that will actually mitigate emissions.
Nick, what does this look? I mean, you're about to undergo pretty stringent budget cutbacks in the UK. What does this look like from Europe?
It's interesting. There was a huge discussion about additionality in the UK and about we will ring-fence the aid budget, but we still got to find the climate money out of that, and we had limited it to 10% of the aid budget. But I must admit, I think we're going to be in the wrong place if we end up in an accounting discussion and a kind of additionality and transparency discussion as the totality, because people are going to have to deal with the fact that there is less money on the table, and when people are cutting hospitals, it's going to be much harder to find money through the system. But the converse is, what about focusing on getting best value or good value from the money? At the moment, it's being thrown out of the door. And actually, you talk to people in countries, and they haven't got this capacity and capability to actually pull together really transformational, innovative approaches which would show the low carbon economy as possible. Yeah. So I think this is where this bottom-up idea comes forward. If we need to, the countries that are taking really imaginative steps forward, who are showing they want to do things, we need to, one, reward them with the money, and two, help them produce things that are financeable with private money as well, which is difficult, using public money to leverage as much as possible, which involves difficult finance designs, and that involves actually harder, involves people on the ground to do this. And the money isn't being cut. The problem is that people are being cut in all governments. So actually we're in a situation, in 3 years' time we could have spent a lot of money and not have a lot to show for it because we've skimped on the capacity on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that we didn't really talk too much in these 2 days is really about leverage, so I wanted to build on that point. There is something called the Climate Investment Funds, which we helped put together when I was at the World Bank before I joined Brookings, and there we're showing leverage of $1 of subsidy money to $8, $9, $10 of public and private funding. So that is actually an avenue that I think has a lot of merit. But another point that was discussed in these last 2 days was really trying to take one of the levers and really making a big impact. And the discussion of energy access was put on the table several times by some of the participants, saying we may not be able to get the global deal by Cancun or maybe even by South Africa. But if we could say, let's really push on getting affordable solutions to both the middle-income countries that want to go green, but also to the poorest countries. We've got 1.5 billion people without access to modern energy services, 2 billion people that use dirty cook stoves. If we could crack that nut, that would also really help in the terms of the trust and maybe get some new solutions on the table.
David, on this one, it's very. We've been running this too much as economists and as political economists for years. So we spent a lot of money through the CDM that went on reasonably non-additional, not that great projects mostly in China and India, and neither showed the low carbon economy was possible nor really changed political attitudes. With this money, we've got to get out of that mindset and think, where will these countries see the most value for their development and climate and energy and poverty reduction from this money? Really synergizing. So in Latin America, you get sustainable transport, really difficult projects to build, but lots of co-benefits. Energy access. It's not just because otherwise you'll see lots and lots of high, expensive renewable energy projects, which may or may not happen anyway, and not these ones which are much more closely linked to development objectives, which are going to really have much more impact politically and transformationally if we're talking about building models of low carbon economies. And I think it worries me that, and it came out that people were talking about, let's reframe this in a development sense. Well, the first place to do that is not in the negotiations, it's how we spend this non-trivial pot of money we've got to spend in the right way, and I worry we haven't got that right yet.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that we were beginning to fall into the kind of negotiator's trap, putting values on everything, counting up the amount of money that's available, talking about targets again, and so on. And that's useful and probably politically necessary, but quite often the programming actually gets lost in all that fog. And a couple of people made the point that that all of a sudden it's not enough money, but it's not an insubstantial sum of money. And how's it going to be spent and how's it going to be programmed? Is this going to be spent by the climate change folk? Or is it going to go through some of the existing aid processes, which have just gone through a really kind of searching re-examination of what works and what doesn't work in development aid? And I know there's a worry by a lot of the people in the aid business that this will get programmed by people who don't understand development, and they'll repeat all the same mistakes we made sort of 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Do you want to speak to that, Kathy?
Well, I mean, I think that we're actually seeing some very interesting signs when you're actually doing work on the ground with some of this climate finance. So some of the work that we did at the bank was saying we want to have the tenet of country-led. So the programs have to, and which is one of the Paris tenets. So it really does have to fit in within a national low-carbon strategy. Yeah? And if that doesn't happen, if that hasn't been well articulated, then we're not in. We're not going to be doing something transformational. So that would be one piece. Second, that the country's really going to be the one putting this in place, and they'll be held account through monitoring to make sure that we actually are looking at the results. It's not just good enough to say, and nor do the countries just want to have a new facility. It's what are we trying to achieve? Low carbon growth. Let's put in place some monitoring pieces of that. Now the rub begins is because some of the other pieces of the Paris Declaration and the aid effectiveness, use of country systems, for example, for social, environmental, financial management, are not yet in place. And that's driving some of the discussion to get direct access to bypass the existing aid agencies.
Now, are we working on the assumption that the bulk of this money is going to go to the poorest countries?
I would think that would the poorest and the ones that need it the most. I think that would satisfy our government. I think in playing in this area that, and I agree with Kathy. I think we've got to look at monitoring the effects and hopefully the positive effects of the spending. But I think that it should go first to the most vulnerable.
Actually, I mean, if you remember the panel which I moderated on bottom up, but people agreed at that they weren't looking for tons of carbon out of the money. The most important thing was to use it to generate innovation, learning models, new models, and political place. And one of that means is that we think some of the money should go to the countries that have made a real commitment who aren't China and India, so they're especially the emerging economies who have the capacity to do new things. So Mexico, Turkey, Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Indonesia. There's places which have made a leadership commitment, have the capacity to do to produce models that others can copy. So there is an issue about the most vulnerable, but there's also about making sure the money goes to those who can drive real models of change that others can learn from. And they need capacity and leadership to do that. You can't do that in the poorest, weakest countries by virtue definition. And that's true for adaptation and mitigation as well.
Though I think the way the conversation is going is that for adaptation, I think there's a fairly widespread understanding that if there is money and it's scarce, the least developing countries, the small island states, maybe the mountain countries will be the ones that will be targeted first. For mitigation, we've got the forest nations in terms of forestry. Again, some with high capacity, others with fairly low capacity, so that's going to be a tricky business. And in terms of the energy-based mitigation, I would agree. The target, I think, should be to learn from what's going on in China and India and Brazil and South Africa, but to really try to focus on that next tier middle-income countries, which may not individually be high emitters, but cumulatively are also part of the solution.
I think with regard to the most vulnerable countries, like when I don't know what the Quick Start Fund started at the MEF process, but it certainly was endorsed by the Major Economic Forum process, and the idea being that we can't wait on that, and that work has to begin immediately to help the most vulnerable to adapt. So I would think that it's a combination of where Nick's point, and I think the point of helping those who are most in need to deal with adaptation.
We should probably de-jargonate a bit as we go along too, because I don't know who the ultimate audience is going to be, but MEF and things like that, I'm glad you spelled it out. This question of political, we went back and forth on this question of political support in developed countries to actually do something about climate change. We had various polls reported back to us that the number of people in Western Europe, and particularly in North America, who still think climate change is a problem is dropping. People are obviously worried about the recession, budget cutbacks, public money is scarce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a division, I think, in the room between those who felt that this, I think we all agree this is probably the greatest single economic crisis we face over the next 50 years. I don't think there was any disagreement on that. The real question was, how do you frame the issue and how do you characterize it? Do you go straight out and say to people that this is a survival issue, and we probably only have 10 or 15 years to get it right, because once you put CO2 and other pollutants in the atmosphere, they have a long residence time. We've done an awful, the scientists told us at the conference that we've done an awful lot of damage already, that we can't do much right now in terms of limiting emissions that is going to have much effect in less than 25 or 30 years. So there was a real major divide between those who felt, go out there, be honest with people, say that this is a survival issue and we have to do something about it, and those who thought, well, we've had 10 years of this stuff and people aren't buying it, or if they're buying it, they're not doing anything about it, and can we characterize this, in addition to being a survival issue, as a kind of opportunities agenda? In other words, the new low-carbon economy will have losers, but it'll have lots of winners. There'll be high-quality jobs, they'll be in cleaner industries, we'll have a nicer environment, and so on. So how do you actually deal with that as an issue? Do you want to try that?
Yeah, and the conversation I think got a bit confused because people were getting a chance to put it together. But for me, it's not either or. To get the issue on the top table and to have that societal and elite conversation about what are the real risks we run and what we need to invest in getting a final solution is vital, because without that you don't get the political investment, diplomatic investment, you don't have the fast start money if it's not for something that vital. But selling the changes you need to make nationally, that is a much more, you want to bring several reasons. And so in Europe we'd say we need to increase our target because it's good for energy security and for economic growth, and because we need to go to a low carbon future, this is the direction we need to go. And so it becomes much more of a context for things that are much more urgent. So the urgent motivators of change are economic and energy security, and climate change is basically showing what that change needs to be, as opposed to driving lots of coal mines. Because you could do the same, you could create the same thing by investing in coal mines rather than renewables. You go renewables because you've got climate change. So in politics, having 4 reasons to do something is usually better than having one. Analysts sometimes find that a bit messy. But I think so, so the two complement each other. But selling change domestically is different to understanding your own national interest, which is where I think the survival issue comes in. And my basic is I don't think national elites in virtually any country get this as a real survival issue yet. And that was just shown. That's why they don't invest enough in trying to solve the problem.
But I mean, you've done a lot of work with the security establishment in Britain. Are they starting to get it?
Yeah, the security establishment in the UK now agree that they cannot maintain the security environment, their leaders, that they've been tasked to do under uncontrolled climate change. And we've nearly got the US security people to say that. They're balking. But the fact is there's no hard security solution to the kind of instability uncontrolled climate change delivers. Getting them to speak to civilians strongly is another constitutional step, but that's one of the next steps we need to take with that.
Bruce?
My concern, and I expressed it in the meeting, is that the present discourse doesn't seem to have galvanized public opinion and the present discourse of sort of the doomsday scenario. And so leading off from discussions that we've had, I thought perhaps we should try to not so much change it, but add to the discourse in a positive way, that by entering into the transformative economy or the transformative technological changes will add value to the economy. And so a very negative message is complemented by a positive message, and hoping that might work, but not disregarding the absolute fact that this is absolutely crucial that we deal with this, but to give a positive reason as to why it would be in everybody's best self-interest to get involved as well.
Okay.
I agree with the but, and in fact, I think what we're seeing is that reframing going on in the public discourse in the United States. We see that in developing countries. It's the part we heard in India. That's how many of the changes were framed as energy security. But one of the other takeaways that I had from the conference was, let's also not be naive. There are going to be transition costs, and so policymakers, politicians also have to confront that now. It's one thing to go out and sell and be behind job creation, energy security, but putting in place the policies that are going to recognize that there will be, at least in the short term, medium term, some losers in society. If you don't address that, you're not going to get the votes, you're not going to get the changes that are going to be required to get leaders to act.
I think that's quite important. I think one of the failings of the Brundtland Commission, this report that's 30-some years old, that actually diagnosed what was happening in the world and created this idea of sustainable development. One of the things I think that went wrong with the implementation of the Brundtland Commission report was the assumption that there were huge numbers of win-win solutions out there. That it wasn't a painless transition, but you could make a kind of painless transition to sustainable development. It's not true. You may have a rational economic win-win solution, but it's very seldom a political win-win solution. I was told the other day, it's very interesting, that in the current debate in the United States about trade sanctions against China, it's being driven to protect American jobs. It's being driven almost entirely by the steel companies and the steel workers union. And virtually every other major company in the United States is opposed to this because they desperately want entry to the Chinese market. But the public perception is this is a job killer, and the American trade unions are opposed to it. And it's really one well-organized union. And in all of these discussions, it's very easy for the losers to identify themselves. The winners may be all of us, and the losers in the climate change debate may be the coal industry. The coal industry is big and well-organized and well-funded, and in the United States has a lot of regional political influence. And the fact that Microsoft and Apple and RIM actually would gain more in terms of high-paying jobs from exporting to China gets lost in the shuffle. So while it may look to us as economists like a win-win solution, it's often not a win-win solution politically, and that was a real mistake by the Commission.
Actually, it reminds me very much of the free trade debate that we went through a
Yeah,
number of years ago, where there was a perception that I think, put forward that this was a great win for everybody, but there was also a certainly underlying part of it that people knew there were going to be tough times ahead for certain groups, and certain groups adapted to it.
Yeah, and if there's a lesson in this, the WTO keeps making this mistake. Every time there's a trade negotiation, the WTO staff are sent out to tell everybody of the enormous economic benefits of the Doha round or the Uruguay round. And there are some, but there are lots of losers, and pretending they don't exist is politically naive and usually results in serious problems down the road.
But I think this is one of the themes which I thought was very productive in the conference, was the idea essentially that previously taboo subjects shouldn't be off limits anymore. Whether that was uncertainty in the science or geoengineering or transition costs, that if we're going to win this, we have to stop sitting in the comfort zone and actually foursquare address issues that are raise real issues and manage them. You can manage transition costs. We work with the unions on a fair transition. We can look at ways of dealing with imports and heavy industries without going to border taxes, lots of different things. But you have to get your hands dirty and get in there and work with other people who are not in the purist environment mode. And that is, I think that's the kind of post-Copenhagen landscape. We could have wished a simpler, easier, cheaper way of getting agreement to solve it. It wasn't really what the world was like anyway, and lots of us knew that it was a bit abstract.
Absolutely.
In a sense, now we've tested that model to destruction. What we have to do is invest in solving these messier problems and dealing with the uncertainty and these new constituencies as if we care about them, not as inconveniences, which is what often happened before. And that's going to take more of us, more empathy, more willingness to look at our own mistakes. And I think that there was a strong theme coming through of that type of shift in mode of operation, which I think doesn't make it easier, but it means it's healthy and we might win. The other one didn't have a chance of winning, even though it was a comfortable narrative to have for oneself.
Well, thank you all very much. I think that's an appropriate note to end this interesting discussion on. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On October 1st to 3rd, 60 experts in the field of climate policy and climate science gathered at the Center for International Governance Innovation to discuss some of the key issues and challenges surrounding the threat of climate change and the need for an ambitious global response.
The conference proceeded with a series of roundtable discussions, keynote addresses, and expert panels aimed at stimulating a lively discussion with regards to strategies and priorities for both short-term and long-term
in either a bottom-up, top-down method, I think would probably work better than leaving it to the high-stakes game at the very end of bringing leaders in. We talked about having a safe place for leaders and for ministers to dialogue with each other, and I think that was one of the more poignant parts, I think, of the last panel we had.
Yeah, it's interesting because the point I was making was that they negotiated almost non-stop last year, literally almost non-stop, but never had a conversation that wasn't part of an official conversation as a negotiator. And
responses to global governance of climate change. And throughout the conference, we had the opportunity to sit down with some of the conference participants and get their insights and opinions on the key topics that were raised during the discussions.
The following is the main discussion that we had with our roundtable moderators, and we will also be releasing individual interviews with conference participants in the days to come.
I think one of the interesting things that came out of this discussion is that that climate change and energy is a kind of cross-cutting issue. It's a kind of issue that it can't best be left to environment ministers, which it has been up until now. And we've had a lively discussion.
Didn't work in Copenhagen, and I really don't think would work. I think we all know how as we move forward in meetings like Copenhagen, usually there's a communique or an agreement that's drafted well before the meeting. And what we don't need again is leaders getting off, as happened to me, leaders getting off the plane wondering where their text is and being able to tell them there is no text. So which is not a pleasant time for either the leader, or certainly wasn't for me either. So I think backing up and trying to look at various ways of doing this.
About this question of how do you bring this onto the agenda of leaders with sufficient warning and attention that they actually understand the issue, unlike Copenhagen, where plane loads of people appeared at the last minute, were given things by their negotiators and their delegates to sign, and clearly felt uncomfortable with it. So maybe we could chat a little bit about that. Bruce, you talked about this because you actually had an example of a sort of human example of being stuck in this situation.
Well, I think the high stakes poker of bringing leaders to bear on the subject matter at the end of a conference